everybody. I hope everybody has had a great week. We are going to, well, I'm going to tell you a little secret. Okay, so I thought this Wednesday would be the last of the Great Pestilence, but like pestilence, guess what? It keeps on going. So no, this will actually go into 4 parts, just because we're not going to be here for 5 hours tonight. So again, when you get in, let me know you're here. Say hello. We always like everybody here in the crypt. And then Liz says, after a day of parasitic assholery, we can use some education about the plague. Absolutely. And what better to cover up the assholery of the day but pestilence? And then Carl says, Liz and Frank and Mother Della, boom, boom. Yes. Hi, Maud. How are you? So we're going to give it just a couple more minutes. Hi, John. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this so far. Hi, Damon Bard. I hope you are doing well. We have been very, very busy this week. Oh, my goodness. Has it not been a busy week? And then John says, sorry, I missed your show last week. I fell asleep 2 minutes before it started. You know, that happens. So you can always catch us on the hashtag replay. That is no problem. And it's going to be pretty easy. Hi, Mikey. It's going to be pretty easy, though. Hopefully, the way I've broken it up, that you don't necessarily have to watch the other ones, even though they are extremely helpful. Because in the first one, for anybody that's just joining us, we talked about when the Great Plague took effect, the one that, the Black Plague, the Great Mortality, the Great Pestilence, when it took place. Hi, Zool. How what it is, how it is, how people get it, different symptoms, how many it killed. We just kind of went over the basics in the first episode. Then in the second episode, we went over how it actually got into Western Europe, its route through Western Europe, that it circled all the way around Western Europe from 1347 to 1353 and ended almost where it had started to begin with. We also talked about how different regions dealt with the plague, different cities and things like that. And then, of course, always like little rabbit holes and bits of information. Well, tonight, what we're going to talk about is personal reactions, the aftermath. Hi, Kisa. So glad you're here. The aftermath of the Great Plague. Hi, Raven. How it affected not only the short-term economics and structure of society and moral behavior, but also how it transformed the world into things that we know as modern-day history, and just great periods of time that may not have happened if it had not been for this terrible plague, and how this plague actually affects how we do things today. So that's kind of how what we're going to talk about tonight. We're also going to cover my favorite part, and that is the art that came out of the Great Mortality. It was very dark, very macabre, and very morose. So we're going to get into that too. Hi, Carl. How are you? And Carl says, Mother, speaking as someone who is a decent speaker myself, I am impressed with your syntax and intonation. Do you teach or speak otherwise? No, but I used to work in customer service. A call center, matter of fact. So maybe that's where it comes from. That might be where my assholery comes from too. I don't know. I have very short tolerance for very stupid things. All right, so looks like we've got quite a bit of people in here. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started. Oh, well, thank you. So John says he loves Mother Delamorte's accent. Why, thank you. I really do appreciate that. And then Liz says moral behavior seems to be in short supply during the current plague. People like to pussyfoot around and all. Well, and I'm telling you, there is some psychological effects that has to do with things like that. You might want to go look it up. I kind of rabbit holed myself into that. And yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. All right. So the Great Pestilence Part 3. This is going to be personal reactions. So, what would you do if you thought the world was coming to an end and you had little time? For an invisible affliction and certain death with no escape, no successful cure, and little hope, how would you react? Would knowing you had a 50-50 chance of escaping the Great Pestilence have any reaction as to how you would behave? Some are optimistic, some are pessimistic, some are proactive, some are resigned, and some are really just indifferent. For someone living through the Great Pestilence of the 1340s, there is no doubt they were asking themselves the very same things. So there's not a whole lot of difference in how human behavior is in many things, especially when it comes to something like this, something traumatic. There's not a whole lot of difference between the people of the 1300s and people today. So, and the difference in the reactions would most likely not be, like I said, any different than the modern world today. From religious zealots to hedonism and everything in between. Many taking what we would think as good advice: eating well, drinking well, eating enough, sleeping enough, fresh air, exercise, and carrying on life as usual. However, there were others that took a bit of a different approach. And right now we're going to talk about the flagellants, or that's really how you pronounce it, but no, I don't mean like flagellant, but the flagellants. Hi, Tyler, how are you? And that is Flagennants. Hi, Calvin. So the flagellants were and are practitioners of an extreme form of mortification of their own flesh by whipping it with various instruments. Most notably, flagellism was a 14th century movement consisting of radicals in the Catholic Church. It began as a militant pilgrimage, most likely out of Germany, and was later condemned by the Catholic Church as heretical. The followers were noted for including public flagellation in their rituals. That basically means whipping themselves, not farting. Believing that by punishing themselves, they would invite God to show mercy towards them, and as a humanitarian effort to show penance for the sins of society. This was a common practice during the Black Death or Great Plague. Now, each whip consisted of a stick with 3 knotted thongs hanging from the end. 2 pieces of needle-sharp metal were run through the center of the knot from both sides, forming a cross, the end of which extended beyond the knot for the length of a grain of wheat or less. Using these whips, they beat and whipped their bare skin until their bodies were bruised and swollen, and blood rained down, splattering the walls nearby. And this is a quote, "I have seen when they whipped themselves, how sometimes those bits of metal penetrated the skin so deeply that it took more than 2 attempts to pull them out." And that was quoted from Henrik von Heffort. Although prevalent in the European continent, the flagellants did not achieve popularity in England. However, a large contingent of the sect crossed the English Channel in 1349 and converged on London. The following description of the flagellants comes to us from Sir Robert of Avesbury, who witnessed their rituals. In that same year of 1349, about the Michaelmas, which would have been around September 29th, over 600 men came to London from Flanders, mostly of Zeeland and Holland origin. Sometimes at St. Paul's and sometimes at other points in the city, they made 2 daily public appearances, wearing cloths from the thighs to the ankles, but otherwise stripped bare. Each wore a cap marked with a red cross in front and behind. each had in his right hand a scourge with 3 tails. Each tail had a knot, and through the middle of it there were sometimes sharp nails fixed. They marched naked in a file, one behind the other, and whipped themselves with the scourges on their naked and bleeding bodies. 4 of them would chant in their native tongue, and another 4 would chant in response like a litany. Thrice they would all cast themselves on the ground in a sort of procession, stretching out their hands like a cross. Singing would go on, and then the one who was in the rear of those thus prostrate, acting first, each of them in turn would step over the others and give one stroke with his scourge to the man laying under him. This went on for the first to the last until each of them had observed the ritual to the full tale of those on the ground. Then each put on his customary garments, and always wearing their caps and carrying their whips in their hands, they retired to their lodgings. It is said that every night they performed the same penance. So let's see what's going on in the comments real quick. Let's see. Oh, looks like we have some more mods in here. Hello, all my beautiful mods and beautiful people. Hi, Kisa. And then Bill says 40 minus 1. Let's see. And then Ma says, hey, what about me? LOL, Ha Flanders. Oh, I'm sure they farted as well, Keisha. Or Kisa, I'm sorry. I always want to call you Keisha. And then Carl says, I'd hate to be in the rear. No, there were no safe words, Carl. There were no safe words. Okay. All right. So while others, talking about the flagellants, they were more of what we would consider the extremely religious zealots. While others went in the polar opposite direction, from gossip and drinking heavily to doing all things in excess, seeing a breakdown to the social order and the breakdown of the moral code. While some people's responses to the plague was to attempt to live better lives, whether to preserve their health or to be more pleasing to God, they separated themselves into small communities of like-minded individuals. Although they ate and drank well, they did so without excess. They also avoided sex. Others, however, took the opposite view, whether they decided to live life to its full while they still could, or because of the disruption to the secular and church law. Many people threw off the moral restrictions of the times. They got drunk, they broke the law, and they had sex wherever and with whomever they pleased. With this disruption to the social standard mechanisms of control, crime rose during the plague. Who'd have thunk? Many houses were abandoned and emptied or occupied by those too weak or sick to defend themselves. So it became common for anyone who pleased to move into the unsecured properties and adopt the place as their own. Career criminals, keen for rich pickings, began to flock to the stricken larger towns, such as London, where they took advantage of the death toll to help themselves to abandon goods. Even after the plague had ended, London still maintained a reputation for greed, immorality, and hard-heartedness. People did not just disregard the law, they also began to discard the usual rules of morality. This change was part due to the lowering of the barriers between the sexes and the classes. Now, Giovanni Boccaccio mentions how, because of the shortage of servants, beautiful and noble women, when they fell sick, did not scruple to take a young or old manservant, whoever he might be, and with no sort of shame, expose every part of their bodies to these men, as if they had been women, for they were compelled by necessity of their sickness to do so. This abandonment of modesty led to a lowering of inhibitions, which Boccaccio also claimed was a cause of looser morals in those women who survived. Indeed, in England, it seemed that fornication was at an all-time high during the plague years. Records show that while fines for crimes in general fell, probably because the authorities could not be bothered to impose them, penalties for adultery and other sexual offenses were on the rise. Sexual licentionists increased as people took comfort and found partners where they could. However, there were also a sense of abandonment about sex in the plague years, as if people were determined to celebrate life while they still could. At the same time, thumbing their nose at death. Orgies in cemeteries became particularly familiar. The graveyard at Camphor in Avignon was particularly famous in this respect, and its orgies came to be so well established and so well known that they continued into the late 14th century, forcing the church to legislate against those who drank, gambled, danced, and had sex amongst the tombs and gravestones. Elsewhere in Europe, graveyards remain the notorious haunts for prostitutes and those who wanted illicit liaisons. Even though it had ended, the plague had changed the moral landscape of Europe. Now, sadly, there was also a lot of scapegoating, because when you really didn't know what to do, I mean, you had some people that went very religious. You had some people that went very much the opposite direction. There were people that were in between, but you also had those that were looking for someone to blame. The Black Death persecutions and massacres were a series of violent attacks on the Jewish communities falsely blamed for outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe from 1348 to 1351. Now, again, the dates are a little bit different. Some say 1347 to 1353. In practice, Jews were often targets of Christian loathing, as the plague swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, annihilating nearly half the population. People had little scientific understanding of the disease and were looking for an explanation. Jews were often taken as scapegoats, and accusations spread that they had caused the disease by deliberately poisoning wells. And we mentioned that last week in the second episode, because in Avignon, quite a few people were burnt at the stake for that. The first massacres directly related to the plague took place in April of 1348 in Toulon province, where the Jewish quarter was sacked and 40 Jews were murdered in their homes. The next occurred in Barcelona. The papacy did come out with statements in defense of the Jews. Pope Clement VI seemed to have risen to the above the hysteria, seeing the violence against the Jews as irrational and dangerous to Christian society. He issued a palpable bull in September of 1348, stating that Jews were dying in numbers as great as the Christians, and they would not be so stupid as to poison themselves. It also stated that the plague was also killing Christians in parts of Europe where there were no Jews that existed. However, the public sentiment against Jews had hardened beyond repair. By 1349, the massacres and the persecutions spread across Europe, including the Erfurt massacre, the Basel massacre, and massacres in Argonne and Flanders. 2,000 Jews were burnt alive on the 14th of February of 1349 in the Valentine's Day Strasbourg massacre, and where the plague had not yet affected the city. Many hundreds of Jewish communities were destroyed in this period. Within 510 Jewish communities destroyed in this period. Some members killed themselves to avoid the persecution. In the spring of 1349, the Jewish community in Frankfurt am Main was annihilated. So there was a big massacre in Frankfurt as well, at Am Main, where they were annihilated. This was followed by the destruction of the Jewish communities in Mentz and Cologne. The 3,000-strong Jewish population of Mentz initially defended themselves and managed to hold off the Christian attackers, but the Christians managed to overwhelm the Jewish ghetto in the end and killed all of the Jews. By 1351, there had been 350 incidents of anti-Jewish, what they call pogroms, and 60 major and 150 minor Jewish communities had been exterminated. All of this because the eastward movement of Northern European Jews to Poland and Lithuania, where they remained so that basically what they did is they moved after all this happened to Poland and Lithuania, where they remained for the next 6 centuries. Now, this also affected the church, but let me check the chats real quick and then we'll move into that. And I am trying to get through this pretty quick because there's a lot here. Ooh, filet mignon. Yes, lots of cemetery orgies. Lots of cemetery orgies. Bukkake, yeah. That's what kept trying to come out. I don't know. Plus, when I show my bones, it's very hard to open and pronounce words. Open my mouth and pronounce words sometimes. The way it sits on the cheeks. Let's see. Carl says, I have all STDs there is, but we're all gonna die, so we just found a cure. There you go. Yeah, it got pretty bad, and we're talking it went from like incestual, all kinds of crazy stuff went on during the plague when it came to that. So when they say hedonism, that they really mean that. Them people went kind of bananas. Let's see who that is. Hi, Angie. How are you? It's great to see you. And Angie says, my aunt made lobster and steak for Valentine's Day one year. Oh, my goodness. That sounds so delicious. Oh, my word. I love me some crab legs and steak and lobster. Num, 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 num. All right. So we know how it kind of, affected people in general on a personal level. Well, it also affected other things that you don't really think of coming out of something so devastating. But the church was, at the time, one of the biggest landholders during the Middle Age. The church's influence, so there was no separation of church and state during the Middle Ages, and during the feudalism periods and the mannerism periods and things like that. The church they influence everything from politics to economics, family relationships, scholarly studies, friendships, social structures, military conflicts, territorial disputes, etc., 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 on to nauseam. So when the plague hit Western Europe, it's easy to understand who the people looked to for comfort and help. But during these years, that help was limited to non-existent in a large majority of the areas. Whether this is due to the fear of the plague or because the local priests had simply died, the 1340s would change the church drastically. What is known is that most, the church included, were caught unprepared for the true devastation that the Black Plague brought with it. So they did know it was coming. That was a psychological brain screw for sure. But to actually have a concept of how bad it was going to be, everybody was caught off guard. Before the plague, the people lived their lives how the Catholic Church told them. The church had always told the people what was right, what was wrong, and gave them direction. When the plague began, people believed it was punishment from God. Priests and bishops lost their credibility because they could not explain the plague or offer a cure. As a result, the people began to stray from the church and question its teachings. The church lost tens of thousands of members from the plague, as well as the large number who lost faith in its authority. Priests and clergy's reputations declined as many people saw that the priests were just as ordinary men and were dying just like they were. They were dying when they were caring for the sick, refused to come into contact with someone and abandoning their post in fear. As a result, new priests were being put into positions who were not educated, and so the church's teachings weakened. Some clergy took advantage of these tough times and charged people for ordinary services. Many people left their wealth and belongings to the church, so it became very wealthy during this period. While people were suffering from the effects of plague, many people turned away from the church as it could not offer them help in this crisis. The Black Death hit the monasteries very hard because of their proximity with the sick who sought refuge there. This left a severe shortage of clergy after the epidemic cycle. Eventually, the losses were replaced by hastily trained and inexperienced clergy members, many of whom knew little of the rigors of their predecessors. New colleges were opened at established universities, and the training process sped up. The shortage of priests opened new opportunities, however, for lay women to assume more extensive and more important service roles in local parishes. Rather than become more religious in thanksgiving to God for survival, people began to harbor doubts. They would turn to the church for an answer to the plague, and the church was unable to help. The Black Plague had a huge impact on human behavior and psychology. The mechanisms and commonplace of everyday life simply stopped, at least initially. With the devastation of the plague, peasants no longer plowed, merchants closed their shops, and some, if not all, churchmen stopped offering last rites. In his book, the Decameron Boccaccio described many of the responses of the people during this time. Because of such happenings and many others of like sort, various fears and superstitions arose amongst the survivors, almost all of which intended toward one end to flee from the sick and whatever had belonged to them. In this way, each man thought to be safeguarding his own health. So basically, all they knew what to do was just turn their back on their fellow man, because it was self-preservation at that point. So let me check the chats real quick. And did you know there are actually plague saints? And we're going to go over just a few real quick. Hi, Lacey. How are you? So glad to see you here. I haven't seen you in a while. Let's see. And so Lacey says, send me a friend's request on Facebook. I will do that. And let's see, Christopher, people of the future are going to be talking about it just like we're talking about the Black Plague. It really is. I mean, you have to admit, with all the stress and all of the just absolutely insanity, whether it be from outside sources or just human behavior in general right now, it's just very odd. We are living in a fantastic time as far as history. And I know that sounds awful because I know that, COVID is not something to celebrate. I know it's hurt a lot of people, but from a historical standpoint, yes, you're absolutely right, Christopher. These periods in our time will not be those periods in time that they just brush over in the history books. So, 200 years from now, they're going to be talking about us. So, it's a very interesting time. Yeah, and Christopher says, yeah, the COVID stuff is going to go down in history. It will. It sure will. And then Carl said, leave your land to the church and we'll guarantee that you don't go to purgatory. True story. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They would, you could actually pay for basically tickets. I forget what they're called. And they may not have been like, everywhere. It might have been just certain areas, but yeah, you could buy basically, you give the church so much money and they'll give you this little, I forget what they're called. And that is your free pass to heaven, bypass purgatory. Yes, you can't get drunk without going fishing. And then Lacey says she's at home with my parents. Awesome, awesome, awesome. And then Mikey also said, also going into history are the great ones of PBDC. Aw. And yes, in that way as well. All right. Okay. So anyway, so yes, there are actually plague saints. The plague saints were saints in the Catholic and Orthodox Christian culture, or plague culture is what they call it, believed to protect against the plague. They number over 100. These saints include some who were very renowned and others that were more localized. The plague saints were depicted on city gates, in panel paintings, in fresco cycles, in works that were commissioned by religious orders, clergy, and others. In medieval and early modern Europe, widespread suffering from the plague epidemics and general pestilence provided ample opportunity for saints to heal the sick and treat the terminally ill. Sufferers commonly prayed to the saints to intercede for them. Three saints that prominently grace the pages in early modern rare book collections are Saint Roche, Saint Charles Borromeo, 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 and Saint Sebastian. So a little bit about Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian was a Christian martyr who was sentenced to die for his faith by the Roman Emperor Diocletian. I probably butchered that very, very badly, who ordered him tied to a post and shot to death with arrows. During the Middle Ages, he became a popular saint to pray to during the plague epidemics. He basically he was the foremost saint for the suffering of Christians, and some see similarities between his arrow wounds and the buba sores of the plague. His popularity increased during the plague epidemics in Europe. Saint Sebastian has been painted by many well-known Renaissance artists such as Raphael, El Greco, Holbein, Piero del Palladio, and a bunch of other ones. I'm not even going to try. There were mass-produced images as well, like engravings and broadsheets. Sebastian is depicted in Florentine engravings from the 1470s that include the text of an invocation that the purchaser is recommended to recite. However, it is the symbolic association of the arrows with the Black Death during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance, which identifies Sebastian as the patron saint of plague victims. So he's really up there at the top. Saint Roche or Rococo, he was a Christian pilgrim. Roche traveled to Rome and throughout Italy, healing those suffering from outbreaks of the plague. At Piazza, he contracted the disease and withdrew to the countryside, where he drank water from a spring that miraculously arose from the ground. He was healed by a dog licking his buba sores and brought him bread to sustain him. Living proof that one could survive the plague, St. Roche was often called upon by sufferers to relieve them of the bubonic plague and other diseases. While St. Roche was identified in most depictions by large plague buboes on his thighs, St. Roche and Sebastian are often shown together. Now, St. Charles Borromeo, while he's more of a modern day Roman Catholics, may recognize Charles Borromeo as an author of the first Roman Catholic, I cannot speak today, catechism. He was venerated in his lifetime for his compassion for the people of Milan during the famine and outbreak of plague from 1579 to 1577. Borromeo, the Archbishop of Milan, provided critical governance and care to the suffering of people when the governor and many of the nobility fled the growing humanitarian tasks and crises. Let's see. He never contracted the plague and credited his general healthy nature to a regular regiment of fasting and prayer. So he says that's the reason he never caught the plague. The dark cloud that the Great Pestilence brought with it shadowed everything and everyone, inspired a number of reactions, from fear, increased religiosity, despair, strange behavior like the flagellant movement, hedonism, cruelty, anti-Semitism, and violence. But there was also a silver lining in the form of new avenues of expression, inspiration, and subject matter. From paintings and sculptures to wood carvings and poetry, to bring something beautiful from something so horrific shows the resilience of the soul and human experience. Even though many artists died and artistic endeavors and projects were abandoned during the Black Death of the 1340s. For example, and this is interesting, the Great Cathedral of Siena, Italy, and the cathedral that isn't there. On the east side of the current church lies what was meant to be the greatest cathedral in all of Europe. In 1339, the city of Siena was powerful and prosperous, and the city fathers launched this hugely ambitious plan. When completed, the Duomo Nuovo was going to dwarf the cathedral that stands today. In fact, it would have dwarfed St. Peter's in Rome and every other church in the world. When the Black Plague swept through the town in 1348, killing up to 80% of the city's inhabitants, along with this tragic loss of life, the dreams of the grandiose cathedral were swept away. It remains to this day unfinished. All that remains of Duomo Nuovo, the most ambitious architectural project of the 14th century, are some markings on the pavement, a few columns and arches, and a magnificent door to the baptistry staircase. The great cathedral that could have been would never be. The art that initially emerged following the Great Pestilence took the form of independent one-person projects or works of art. The style changed as well. Where flowery, beautiful devotions were once popular, those quickly fell out of favor, as most felt they no longer represented the world around them. Artwork took on a much darker and macabre theme that would later become part of the much larger memento mori tradition. One very popular artistic trend is called the three living meet the three dead. The three living men traveling meet the three corpses. Sometimes these are the ancestors of the three traveling men. Sometimes the three travelers are representing the three classes: nobility, clergy, and peasantry, with the three corpses as sort of an allegory representing that death comes to us all, or is the great equalizer. This popular artistic theme could also be found in written religious works called psalters, and that is spelt P-S-A-L-T-E-R-S, but it's pronounced psalters. A psalter is a volume containing the book of Psalms, often with other devotional material. Until the emergence of the Book of Hours in the late Middle Ages, psalters were the books most widely owned by the wealthy layperson. They were commonly used to learn to read. Many psalters were richly illuminated, and they included some of the most spectacular surviving examples of medieval book art. So when you see like the really fancy book art that has like the one big letter at the top before all the writing, and it's got all the pictures around it and things like that, usually lots of golds and greens and blues and red, that is a psalter, is what you're looking at. The Delilah Psalter is what we're going to talk about now. The basic version of this story goes, three young noblemen were out hunting when they suddenly come across three corpses, which are in a varying stage of decay, but nonetheless still animated. Unsurprisingly, the men expressed shock and dismay at the sight, while the three corpses admonished them to consider their transgressions of life and to improve their behavior before it is too late. The dialogue between the two groups is sometimes explicit, which describes the ensuing conversation. Interestingly, though, In the Delisle Psalter, the above the double register miniatures is a series of inscriptions giving additional voices to the character. And it reads, "The three living cry out." One says, "I am afraid." The other says, "Lo, what I see." And the third says, "Methinks these be devils three." And the dead reply. The first one, "I was well fair." The next one, "Such shall you be." And the last, "For God's love beware by me." Even more dark and macabre were the architectural and sculptured works known as, and this is something I learned, cadaver tombs or transy tombs. Cadaver tombs or transy tombs, as they are also known, began to be used in the 14th century. After the Black Death had swept through Europe, killing at least 1/3 and perhaps as much as half of the population. Mortality at such a vast and shocking scale would have been deeply unsettling to those left behind. And the macabre imagery of the cadaver tomb reflects people's heightened preoccupation with death at this time. The cadaver sculpture could act as a memento mori, a reminder of death, and subverted the popular fashion for effigies to depict an idealized image of the deceased. In medieval Europe, where belief in heaven, hell, and the afterlife was so powerful, the cadaver tomb would serve as a sobering reminder to those viewing it that everyone must die. Sometimes the effigies would be rotten corpses of the rich and powerful because they were incredibly symbolic. Not only did they show death as being the great leveler, but they have also been interpreted as being penitential, so for penitence. Many believe this form of funerary art was a result of people's fear concerning the plague pits. Basically, and this right here, what is being showed right now, is what is called a cadaver tomb or a transy tomb. If you look at the top, you see more of an effigy. This is what someone would have looked at their most best in life or heaven. If you look at the cadaver tomb below it, that is their basic memento mori. That is their skeleton. And below that, of course, would be the actual body in the tomb itself. So that is, when you see those, they're called transy tombs or cadaver tombs. Now, many people believe that one of the reasons that people were just so, like, occupied with death and all that kind of stuff is because on a psychological level, people seeing the plague pits basically to be lost with no markers and no really one place for your loved ones to come and like pay their respects was just absolutely horrifying. I mean, it was mentally, it just broke some people mentally. And it was just a desperate need to be remembered. So they think that that's kind of where, because if you see coming out of the medieval, everything is very gothic, everything is very over the top and frou-frou, which kind of carries on into what we know is like the Victorian times and things like that, because they went through a whole nother death culture thing and were enamored and preoccupied with death. And you see the return of like the effigies, the death effigies or cadaver effigies and different things like that with a lot of the cemetery, the Victorian cemeteries and things like that. And these transy tombs would stay in popularity, like I said, for the next 2 centuries after the first wave. Now, I didn't write this down, but just to explain a little bit, because I love looking at like what things mean on tombs and things like that. If you see like whether it's in a written form or painting or fresco or even like sculpture or architecture, things like that, of these cadaver tombs or these transy tombs or these memento mori type of sculptures, many times you will see worms. And the reason that you see worms, and this is kind of odd, is because obviously the medieval person would understand the relationship between death and maggots. I mean, that's just a given. But they didn't understand the fact that it came from flies. They actually thought that basically people had worms in them, and the buboes and the disease is what actually pulled the worms out. So when somebody may have seen a corpse with maggots or something like that on it, instead of thinking that those worms came from an outside source, it was believed that the sickness brought the worms out of the person, which is totally disgusting. And that's something new I learned as well. The most popular form of artistic interpretation is the dance of death, or better known as the dance macabre. The dance macabre can be found in drawings and paintings and woodcuts of the time. The skeleton, or in some cases, skeletons, are usually involved in some kind of dance, and often showing in a long line, holding hands with the living, dancing them away to their deaths, somewhat like the Pied Piper. The key point in all dance macabre representations is that every member of society is shown being an active member in the participation of the dance. Interestingly enough, scholars know many of these dance macabre depictions have unfortunately been lost to time, but they are mentioned in written records. In the case of, and I'm going to try not to butcher this, Cemetery des Innocents, which basically is Cemetery of the Innocents. Basically, is what it is. Written record account, a very large depiction of the dance macabre was painted on a wall within this cemetery. Sadly, the painting nor the cemetery exist any longer. The Cemetery of Innocents, Paris's oldest, largest, and most famous cemetery, was found right in the heart of the city, near the bustling Les Halles market, or central to Parisian life. It accepted its first denizens in the 12th century, beginning life as a nice enough cemetery or graveyard with individual, ordinary burials marked in the proper way. As Paris grew, so did the demand on its principal place of burial, which, through the largest in the city, covered an area of just 130 meters by 65 meters. So for the size of Paris, it was teeny tiny. When the space ran out, mass burials began to be conducted. Up to 1,500 dead could be buried in one pit before it was closed and a new one was dug. Now, this was in the cemetery that already existed. One gets the image of the dead of Paris being swept continually under the threadbare carpet, squashed down as best as could be managed, but increasingly given way by onerous bulges. The whole cemetery, in my imagination, looked like some nightmarish, fulsome, feckled sea frozen at the height of tempest. But still, this ground was expected to swallow more and more bodies. Things reached a grisly point in the days of the Terror. And I mentioned that in last week's episode. The Great Terror, which happened prior to the Black Plague or the Great Mortality, was basically kind of like what happened in Salem with the witch trials, except in this case, it was a fungus that got on a lot of the grain and basically just made people just like trip balls and go out of their mind. And it was called the Great Terror. When bodies were simply dumped around the edges of the place. Piles of uniterated body parts are never good for the reputation of a good neighborhood. And that of the Innocents were particularly fearsome. Charnel houses grew up all around the cemetery and worked tirelessly in a vain attempt to clear more space. This did nothing to help the smell, which was as if all the bad smells of the world had gathered in one place to throw a stench party. It was said you could catch a disease simply by walking past the cemetery, providing, that is, that you survived your walk past the cemetery. Unlike the poor shoemaker who fell into one of the burial pits one night in 1776 and was found dead the next day, the innocence became even more unsavory by night when it was taken over by thieves, whores, or prostitutes. That is old word. I'm not calling anybody a name, so chill out. Necromancers and enterprising grave robbers who sold fresh bodies to medical students. The situation came to a head in the 1700s when the common grave of the poor of Paris began to subside and the bodies exploded into the cellars of nearby houses. In 1780, there was a fatal outbreak of disease in the nearby Rue de la Lagerie. After a long period of heavy rain in the spring of 1780, a line was finally drawn. The cemetery of innocents would never bury another soul. With this closing of the innocents and all other cemeteries within the city limits, the dead of the Paris would now be buried away from the city central. The only remaining physical link to the cemetery is the Fountain des Innocents in the Les Halles district. The fountain, built in the 16th century for the entry into the city of Henry II, once stood against the wall of the cemetery. The bones from the Cemetery of Innocents were moved to the catacombs of Paris, where they reside today. A sign at the entrance reads, "Stop. This is the Empire of the Dead." And that's where we're going to end it tonight. So I hope you enjoyed that. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end this with actually going through the comments. And then we'll be on to the last part, I promise, next week. Yes, I love Monty Python. I love Monty Python. Has anybody seen the movie Squirm? I want to say I have. Didn't they change the name of that? Or has it always been Squirm? Because I think it used to have a different name, or it had a different name somewhere else, or maybe it was just really like another movie that was very similar. Boobos sound like a pet name for somebody's boobs. Yes, yes, Maud. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. What, they play pinochle on your snout? Something, 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 something. I don't remember the words. I used to know them when I was little. Lace and white powder. Tom, we did miss you. We did miss you. Some guy named Yom kept coming around here, and we told him to, take a hike. We were waiting for Tom to come back. Let's see. Arg, shiver me timbers, is what Mikey says. What light from yonder window breaks? So Maud says, leave it to the French to make architecture out of bones. Yeah, and there are a lot of bone churches in Poland too. And I know most of you guys are familiar with kind of the macabre, type of historical stuff. But if you're not familiar with the bone churches, especially in Poland, go look that up. That is absolutely number one on Odd Mama's list of places to go, as well as the Paris catacombs. I really, really want to go there, even though that place really freaks me out a lot. And if you haven't seen the movie, it's fiction. And it's got the girl from, I think she played in Buffy, I think. Anyway, she plays in it, called Catacomb. It's actually a Canadian movie. And if you haven't seen that, so it came out, I think, in the early 2000s. It's really good. But yeah, it's kind of creepy. Kind of creepy. Well, thank you, Angie. I'm glad you enjoyed that. We're gonna wrap it all up and put a big fat black bow on it come next week. So, well, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you have a great rest of the week and weekend. We will be back next Wednesday. And then we do have, if you didn't have a chance to check out our newest content artist, Miss Genevieve of the Creepy Parlor, She comes on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then that's followed up with beautiful Miss Cindy, our medium that does, card readings and things like that. But check out Creepy Parlor. If you haven't gone over there, give it a like, follow, and share. We really, really would appreciate it, because we like to determine these kind of things. We don't leave it to Facebook to determine that kind of stuff, because they would rather we pay. And that's just not something we're going to do. So, but I really do appreciate you guys joining in. Let's see, Friday we're going to have, Roots Bleed Red, and we may be having Cemetery Joe, which if you have not checked out his new show, it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. He does like the old horror host. We're wanting to bring that back. That, for a lot of us old farts, growing up with the horror hosts such as, Dr. Shock and Svengoolie and, Elvira and different places like that. It's kind of a dying art. And we, he's really wanting to bring that back, and we are wholeheartedly behind him 110%, because I think that's something that the younger generations need to they need to experience that. It was always very cool, very, very cool. That's right, Roots Bleed Red. You guys need to check this out. They're gonna have a special guest, the daughter of a murderer. So please check that out. That's going to be interesting. I love the psychological shows like that, to where you can actually ask questions and things like that. That's going to be extremely interesting. And then Saturday, we will have our lovely Tom, as well as the random show. Maybe it's very random. We never know when the random show is going to show up. So that should be this coming up Saturday. Sunday, I think we're fairly open, I do believe. And then Monday, we are going to have our beloved Doomsday. He will be here. And then Tuesday, we will just start all over again. So let's see, what is Mont saying? So, okay, so there will be a random show that will be making appearance on Saturday. So, the random show now is kind of reminding me of like Monty Python's Flying Circus. Like you don't know what to expect, when it's going to show up, and what they're going to be doing. So they keep it real with randomness. So anyway, have a pleasant night tonight, guys, and pleasant nightmares. Bye.